Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to MACFEST 2024. Wherever you are joining us from, tell us in the chat where you are sitting in the world. I'm sitting in the UK. My name is Yixuan, and I'm a member of my faculty team. As Ramadan continues, we have today another delightful event about cuisine and culture with Professor Daniel Newman, Food and Identity in Muslim Spain. Our host for today is Andrew Nowell, who will introduce Professor Newman. Andrew Nowell is a press officer for the Natural Friendly Farming Network, which seems a more environmentally friendly future in agriculture. He was formerly a journalist working in Manchester. This is his third year of hosting an event at MACFEST. Before we start, I'd like to thank you for all your donations to MACFEST, which help us to create so many incredible events, mostly free for you. We have a lot more coming this year, so please stay connected via newsletter and on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and LinkedIn. Use our hashtag #SpreadHoney, And today, feel free to post your comments and questions in the chat or in the Q&A portal. We will answer them all. And over to you, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Yixuan, and good afternoon, everyone. It's good afternoon here in the UK, good morning or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Salam alaikum, and welcome to this event, which is part of the Ramadan Festival here at MACFEST 2024. As Yixuan has just explained, I'm a press officer with the Nature Friendly Farming Network. So when I was given the choice of events to host this year by Kaisra, as I'm working in the environmental sector, in the agricultural sector, then the one about food was a fairly straightforward choice for me. Before that, I was a journalist here in Manchester, and I've now been hosting for a few years, and it's lovely to be back once again, joining the MACFEST team to host this event. This afternoon, we're taking a trip back in time to Al-Andalus to explore the link between food and identity in Muslim Spain. And we've got the authoritative figure for this historical travel that we're doing, this historical journey we're going on in the form of our speaker, Professor Daniel Newman. He hosts the Chair of Arabic Studies at the University of Durham here in the UK, and he has a large number of research interests which include Arabic travel literature, 19th century Arab reform movements, and Islamic medicine. His books include An Imam in Paris, accounts of a stay in Paris by an Egyptian cleric, 1826 to 1831, and Muslim Women in Law and Society, for which he was the co-recipient of the World Award of the President of the Republic of Tunisia for Islamic Studies. His most relevant research interest to this afternoon's event, though, is his fascination with medieval Arab culinary culture, and all things to do with cooking and food in the medieval Arab world. He's written a couple of books on this topic, including The Sultan's Feast, a 15th century cookbook, which was longlisted for the Peter Mackenzie Smith Book Prize in 2021, and his most recent publication, The Exile's Cookbook, Medieval Gastronomic Treasures from Al-Andalus and North Africa. His expertise in this field has been recognised by Al Jazeera, who broadcast a 6-part series by him on medieval Arab food. And it's an ongoing interest of research which Professor Newman has, and which he regularly shares online. You can see this on his Instagram, which is medieval_Arab_cooking, and on his blog, eatlikeasultan.com. On an ongoing basis, he recreates recipes from the medieval Arab world and presents the dishes for everyone to see and to have a look at. So, without any further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Professor Newman.
Thank you very much, Andrew and Yixuan, for the introductions, and thank you also to the wonderful people at MACFEST 2024, Kaisra and her amazing team. And it's both an honor and a pleasure to be back here this year. Since last year, the discussion centered on other aspects of medieval cuisine, particularly related to the book that you mentioned, The Sultan's Feast. If we can have the slide, the opening slide, thank you very much. So the object of the talk today, and it's an apt one because we are in Ramadan as well as in Lent. And so food, of course, plays an important role, a very important role, particularly in terms of denying oneself food as an act of devotion and worship. On the other hand, of course, it's perhaps not the best talk because we'll be talking a lot about food. We'll be showing some pictures of delectable dishes, but I hope it will give people who are fasting some ideas for future iftars. So the object of the talk today is an area in Spain that was under Muslim control for many centuries, from the early 8th, in fact, until, of course, the late 15th. And in Arabic, it's known as Al-Andalus, a word which, in case you're wondering, is conventionally linked to the Vandals, who were known as Al-Andalish in Arabic. And it was the Vandals who named the originally Roman province of Baetica in the south of Spain, which roughly corresponds to the modern region, Spanish region of Andalusia, Vandalicia. And so you can see there a map from which was drawn up by a Persian geographer by the name of El-Istahri in the 10th century, although this is from a manuscript that dates to the 13th. And in the middle there, to the right, you see this location. You don't need to know Arabic. You don't have to be able to read Arabic. You see the big thing, red circle in the middle. That is Cordoba, in Arabic, Cordoba, which of course was the seat of Umayyad power, and which is here dutifully put in the center of the region. If I can have the next slide, please. And here we have another medieval map. This one was done by somebody who is undoubtedly the greatest geographer of the Middle Ages, the Moroccan Sharif el-Idrisi, 12th century, who traveled around Al-Andalus and in fact studied at the already mentioned Cordoba. At some point he entered the employment of the King of Sicily, Roger II, for whom he made a planisphere and also a book. And so his book was intended to accompany this planisphere and is one of the major sources of geographical knowledge in the Middle Ages. The manuscript also contains a number of wonderful illustrations, of which this is one. The more modern looking map shows the progression, so that's at the bottom, shows a progression of the so-called Reconquista, the Christian reconquest, although that's a very problematic term, since it can't really be called a reconquest, because that would imply that the Castilians, for instance, were actually Visigoths, which of course they weren't. But let's leave that for now. This simply to situate the area that we'll be focusing on. We can move on to the next slide, please. So Al-Andalus, we have to go back to the spring of 711 when an Arab, though most of them were Berbers, Amazigh, as we would say today, army of some 7,000 soldiers took advantage of the weakness of this Visigothic state, and with the help of a Spanish dignitary, man by the name of Count Julian, they invaded the Iberian Peninsula. But of course, the man who is credited with the glory of conquering Al-Andalus was Tariq bin Ziyad. And his name, of course, is also at the origin of the English word Gibraltar, which is a corruption of the Arabic phrase, of course, Jabal Tariq, that is to say, Tariq's mountain. The conquest was a very easy one, and the Visigothic king Roderick's troops were no match for the Muslim soldiers, who quickly cut a very wide swathe through the peninsula, relentlessly pushing northward and, of course, penetrating into France, where they suffered their first defeat at the hands of Charles Martel in 732. An interesting side note is that though this historical fact has been taught to every European schoolboy for centuries as a major event, it hardly merits a mention in Arab chronicles. Now, in terms of population, the majority of population, of course, was Muslim. Most of them, however, were Spaniards or others who converted after the conquest, often to avoid paying the religious duty that non-Muslims living in Muslim territories had to pay. The biggest ethnic group was actually the Berbers. The Arabs were always a minority. Other ethnicities that we find in Al-Andalus was a large African group, mainly from the Sudan, who had arrived as slaves, and also Slavs, so people from Central and Northern Europe, as they were known in Arabic as Saqaliba. Now, the newly converted Muslims, neo-Muslims as they were known, were only new, of course, during their lifetime. And the distinction quickly blurred because their descendants, of course, remained in the faith. Nevertheless, their non-Muslim origin was often known through the retention of their previous family names. The non-Muslims in Andalusi society comprised both Christians and Jews, those who hadn't converted, but they nonetheless enjoyed protection from Muslim rulers and were active across all economic sectors. The social classes of the Muslim population of Al-Andalus were not that different from anywhere else in the Muslim world. The broadest categories were those of the elite, in Arabic al-Khasa, and the general population, the populace. The proletariat is a word that's sometimes used, el-Ama. Additionally, there was a middle class, which was composed predominantly of merchants. And of course, there were also other groups that enjoyed special privileges, such as scholars, particularly religious scholars, who often were quite influential. Al-Andalus enjoyed a number of natural advantages, which made it a center for trade and a hub for international exchanges between the Maghreb, North Africa, the Near East, and Europe. It was a major center, for instance, for northern slaves who would be shipped to the Eastern Mediterranean, but it was famous for its natural resources across the Muslim world due to the fact that it boasted several ecological zones. And so Al-Andalus was praised for its fertility and crops, all kinds of cereals, vegetables, and fruits. Sometimes the authorities established monopolies and regulated prices of staple products such as grain in order to ensure regular supplies, just as was the case, incidentally, in other Islamic regions as well. Linking it to our topic of the day, of course, we're interested in ingredients. And one of the important ingredients are, of course, spices. Now, here we have an interesting picture that emerges. The majority of spices, which were used very frequently in large quantities in Andalusian cuisine, as well as in perfume making, for instance, and medicine, were imported. And these included things like musk, camphor, cloves, cinnamon, rosewater, and spikenard, and of course pepper, which was probably the most used spice. So these all had to be shipped in, sometimes, of course, from very far-flung areas, but this only demonstrates the importance of Arab merchants in the spice trades, which they dominated, in fact, had a monopoly over for many centuries. Saffron was produced in several regions of Al-Andalus. In fact, Andalusian saffron was rated quite highly, especially in the town known in Arabic as Basta, the modern Baza, which, according to one chronicler, produced enough saffron to satisfy the demand of the entire Muslim population of Al-Andalus. So that's quite a claim. And this also meant or explains why already in the 10th century Spain was an exporter of saffron, as well as, incidentally, ambergris and ginger. And it was also self-sufficient in cumin, coriander, oregano, and caraway, all of which were used in the medieval cuisine. The spice trade was very prolific. And one 13th century source tells us that over 3,000 spice varieties were available in the country. The diversity in the great supply of both homegrown and imported food items is, of course, reflected in Andalusian gastronomy. If I can have the next slide, please. The cuisine of Al-Andalus is part of an extremely rich culinary tradition, which spanned more than half a millennium from the 9th to the 15th centuries, with a total of 10 surviving cookery books from a geographical area that covers Al-Andalus to Tunisia, Egypt, Damascus, Baghdad, and another 50 books, cookery books, are known by name from other sources. So an extremely rich tradition, in fact, the richest in the Middle Ages, by far exceeding any other culinary outputs. Now, when it comes to Andalusian cuisine, we're very fortunate that it's well documented, most notably in 2 cookery books, of which more in a second. What are the other sources? Well, there's some interesting ones that perhaps one doesn't think of straight away when talking about cooking and recipes. And the first I'd like to mention the so-called Hizbah manuals. Now, Hizbah is a word that originally refers to the Muslim's duty to promote what is morally good. However, it very soon came to refer to the supervision of the market by an inspector known as the muhtasib, to ensure, of course, that people in the market traders, complied with this religious injunction. Now, these manuals, which were written in other parts of the Islamic world as well, are an invaluable source in terms of ingredients, but also of the various ready-made foods that were sold at market. Something we today, of course, would call street food, and thus the diet of the common people, because commoners would not be cooking at home. And so what do we find? What do these manuals tell us? Well, we have stores selling all kinds of bread, cold snacks, zalabiya, so that's a sweet still around today, qataif, the crepes, roast meat, sheep's head, fried fish, harissa, a meat porridge, not to be confused with the modern Tunisian harissa, which of course is a sauce, sausages, various dairy products, confectionery, juices, syrups, and so on and so forth. Now, the main task of the market inspector was to act essentially as a fair trading standards officer and to prevent fraud, of which, so the manuals inform us, there was quite a lot around. Related to weights and measures, the purity of ingredients, the preparation of dishes, and of course, especially medicines that were sold at market. And then, just as today, we would find that the more expensive the ingredient, of course, the more likely it was that people would try to mix it with other impure or unrelated products. Some of them quite troubling, but the penalties were quite stiff, as you can imagine. Agricultural treatises constitute another source, and a genre that was particularly prolific in Al-Andalus. And numerous scholars, in fact, were involved in this, one of whom that I've listed here is the Sevillian, so from Seville, Ibn al-Awam, who wrote a monumental book of agriculture, which was a regular bestseller. Next, we come to medical, pharmacological, and dietetic works, which also include a mass of relevant information about food and diet. One of the leading lights here is the Malaga-born scholar Ibn al-Baytar, and these works were rooted in robust empirical research. These were not armchair scholars. And Ibn al-Baytar himself is a good example, but there are many others that were active in the same period that did the same. They would scour the world in pursuit of science, in pursuit of new discoveries, new plants, new applications of plants, and so on and so forth. And then finally, we have agricultural calendars, which of course are very useful since they tell us a lot about harvesting of crops, types of crops, and of course, by extension, what the diet of local people would have been. It was very much, this is important to add, it was very much what today we would call a sustainable economy. Everything was used at the right time. People lived according to the seasons. There was very little food waste. They were food that wasn't consumed would be cured, pickled, and preserved in a variety of ways. So no waste economy. Can we move on to the next slide, please? And so I mentioned that there are two cookery books, and here we have just one page of the manuscripts. So the one on the right is, they're both from the 13th century, which is quite interesting. The one on the right is an anonymous cookery book, contains about 498 recipes. And until relatively recently, it was thought to survive in only one manuscript, which was held in, or which is still held in Paris. However, a Moroccan scholar discovered another copy of this text in Morocco. It's a much later manuscript. The Paris manuscript dates to the 17th century, whereas the Moroccan one is a lot later. And it's essentially the same text with some minor differences. The one on the left is the book by a man called Ibn Razin al-Tujibi. And as I said, also from the 13th century. And this was somebody who was born in Murcia in Spain and fled his native Al-Andalus because the Christian armies were pushing down, and first moved to Morocco, then to Algeria, or what is today Algeria, of course, and finally ending up in Tunis, where he composed this book. We can be fairly certain that he composed the book in Tunis because the book is also, to some extent, an autobiography. It's a culinary autobiography in the sense that he refers to dishes that, or habits, dietary habits, that he experienced in other parts of North Africa. So we have, for instance, references to the Algerian town of Bijaya. We have references to that the people of Tunis would eat a dish this or that way. And as a result, and this is why I translated it as the Exile's Cookbook, it is also a man who is looking back. He's looking back to his native land, which he never saw again, dying in Tunis. And so it's an anthology of the Andalusian culinary heritage. That one is also quite extensive, and it contains 480 recipes. What is important here is that both of these, so it's a huge number just for Andalusian recipes, there are considerable overlaps. which can be explained in a number of ways. On the one hand, one may suggest that they both dipped into an existing common pool of recipes, or that one copied from the other, or a mixture of both. It's very difficult to ascertain which of these possibilities is the correct one. Leaving that aside, the cookery books contain really a wide variety of recipes, not just for dishes, savory dishes, but also sweets, beverages, all kinds of breads, some medicinal recipes, even hand washing powders. So it really covers the entire dining experience as it would have taken place at the time, and also reveal a decidedly Andalusian cuisine, as we shall see later. May we go on to the next slide, please? Now, the influences on Andalusian cuisine came from a variety of sources, some local, but many of them from the East, which was considered an example to emulate, even if it was mixed up with the mythology of early Abbasid culture. And the cookery books regularly refer to Eastern dishes. So it was clear that the authors or compilers recognized these dishes as being foreign, even if they were later transformed in the process. And of course, when we talk about foreign intervention, we can't not talk about a very famous person by the name of Ziryab. Ziryab, a singer of Persian birth, who was at the court in Baghdad, but got into a spot of bother as a result of jealousy because of his fine voice. He was forced to leave Baghdad and eventually settled in Cordoba, where he became a leading cultural figure at the court of the Umayyad ruler Abdurrahman II. Now, in addition to establishing his reputation as a musician, a musical innovator, Ziryab became the undisputed leader of fashion, culture, and etiquette in Cordoba. He also did many other things when it comes to food. He introduced the asparagus. So those of us who like asparagus, we have Ziryab to thank for it, because, of course, it is through Al-Andalus that much of the Arab ingredients in medieval European cuisine entered Europe. And so there's the asparagus, but he also introduced a number of recipes which he had brought with him. And we have to assume, I'd like to assume anyway, that he came with a cookery book. And if we are going to speculate, I should like to think that perhaps it was the cookery book written by his patron, Ibrahim bin al-Mahdi, the half-brother of Harun al-Rashid, also musician and gastronome extraordinaire. But as I say, this is just speculation. What is also significant is that one of the earliest substrates in the medieval Arab culinary tradition comes from Persia, Sassanid Persia. And so Ziryab brought with him this Persian substrate. So there are dishes that have a clear Persian origin that we then find in Al-Andalus. Now, the cookery books reflect a high degree of mobility. So not just of ingredients, but also dishes. Across the Muslim world. So I mentioned Persia, but also one of the cookery books, for instance, has a recipe that is said to be Turkish. Now, though for the most part, these cookery books reflect the dining tables of the elite, which is, of course, quite natural, there's also information about the diet of the common folk. And the market inspector manuals, of course, also support some of those dishes. So what did the general population eat? Well, generally we can say that it was very cereal based. So a lot of cereals, soups, gruels, potages and porridges. And again, remember, we're talking about those that didn't have the financial means in order to buy a lot of meat, and definitely not able to buy these expensive, precious spices. Other things that are quite prominent, particularly in the market inspector manuals, things like the harissa, which I've already mentioned, and also the tharid. The tharid, originally an Eastern dish, in fact from the Arabian Peninsula, which is essentially bread sopped in a sauce of vegetables and meat. But we'll have occasion to return to the tharid in a minute. Noodles, and of course vegetables, quite a lot of vegetables. And as I said, thanks to the very fertile soil of the Iberian Peninsula. Other main ingredients include dairy, particularly eggs, cheese, milk, yogurt. And the cookery books also reveal some more unusual sources of food, such as snails and locusts. Cooking in Al-Andalus was mainly done in olive oil. Of course, the olive was king. It's the land of the olives. And another crucial ingredient, which will be mentioned in a minute, murri. Now, the kitchen equipment, I've already mentioned that the average person did not cook at home because they didn't have a kitchen. They would use a communal oven known as the furn. Sometimes they might perhaps prepare the dough, as is still the case in some countries, and then you take it to the baker and they will bake the bread for you. We can have the next slide, please. So, talking about religious communities and food, but before we do that, what can we say that is decidedly Andalusian about the cuisine? Well, I've already mentioned the ingredients, and some of them are also found in other regions, but Al-Andalus truly had a very distinct flavor pattern. And so there is something like an Andalusian cuisine, which of course reflected on the one hand the population's, the local predilection for certain flavors and ingredients, as well as being linked to local conditions. For instance, the infrequent use of rice is linked to the fact that rice was only grown in a very small area of the Iberian Peninsula. A number of dishes appear in the cookery books that really are found only in Al-Andalus, as well as ingredients. For instance, things like duck, rabbit, beef, which were not really used in the East. The extensive, one might even be tempted to say excessive use of eggs, which are found in almost every dish. I always like to say that an Andalusian cannot or could not make a dish unless it also contained eggs, sometimes several layers of eggs. Chicken, which is perhaps not surprising in light of what I've just said about the eggs, and also tuna. Again, tuna not found as an ingredient in the other cookery books. Sometimes they imported dishes and gave them an Andalusian twist. So they naturalized them in order to fit in with their own culinary identity. The spices, also quite interesting. The main spices, very Andalusian in terms of the frequency and composition. Coriander, pepper, used in the vast majority of dishes, cinnamon, ginger, mint, and cumin. But then that ingredient that I mentioned earlier, murri. Now, murri is a true mystery. Murri, well, the ingredient itself isn't a mystery, but what is the mystery is that here we have an ingredient that was used across the entire culinary tradition in both West and East of the Islamic world, in a huge number of dishes, mainly savory, in fact, exclusively savory, and afterwards just disappeared. The book by Tujibi contains no fewer than 13 recipes to make this condiment, including a very unusual one made with fish, which would make it a relative of the Roman garum, although the preparation of both differed considerably. Now, murri essentially involved rotting and fermenting barley or another cereal, and it was a very long process that took several months. Perhaps this may explain why it eventually fell out of favor, although Tujibi's book also contains an instant version, which I've made and which is also very enjoyable. In terms of flavor, murri is very similar, again, not surprising, is very similar to soy sauce. And of course, was used as a, to add a salty flavor. Now, in light of Al-Andalus being such a multi-confessional space, what about references to the various religious communities? In other words, do the culinary collections reflect a religious identity? Well, let's start with Muslim dishes. And I put it in inverted commas for reasons that I hope will become clear very shortly. In fact, there are no real Muslim dishes in this, almost 1,000 recipes in both books. Except, of course, that haram food is not included, so there's no wine and there's no pork. But for instance, there's no references to Ramadan, so Ramadan dishes. There is one oblique reference to a dish, a tharida, that requires the use of parts of sacrificial sheep, so associated with the Eid al-Adha. That's really about it. When it comes to Christian dishes, things are also quite unusual, one might say. Now, both cookery books contain so-called rahibi recipes, and rahib monks are monks' dishes. What is monkish about them? I hear you say, well, I don't really know. And the recipes don't really tell us much either, because in one of the books, they're all made with lamb or beef. But in the other manual, the rahibi recipes can be made with beef, with chicken, pigeon, or even fish. The ingredients don't really offer much solace either. What is interesting is that there are some references to ingredients from Christian Europe. For instance, Tujibi refers to the fact that the mustard from Christian Europe is the best and so should be used. On other occasions, the same author refers to a recipe that is eaten a lot by Christians. Once again, it's not quite clear why, and also the use of a particular sauce. What is relevant to the discussion is, of course, the religious connotation of certain ingredients, which would become a very big thing later on, with particularly, of course, the Spanish religious authorities being on the lookout for anybody that they suspected of being a crypto-Muslim. So the fact of not eating pork, for instance, was considered to be suspicious. But even in the period under discussion, parsley is a very nice example. Because parsley is used less in Andalusian cuisine than in the East, because parsley was considered to be a Christian herb. Coriander was the Muslim herb by par excellence. We're moving on then to our third community. The anonymous Andalusian treatise contains 6 allegedly Jewish recipes. And so what are these recipes? They're made with partridge, with chicken, and one is made with aubergine and meat. Aubergine and meat, incidentally, very popular dish in the East. One was fried aubergine with meat, which was called a buraniya, named after the wife of the great Caliph al-Ma'mun. That was her signature dish. So aubergine, in fact, aubergine is one of the most popular vegetables in the cookery books. So other than the name, there do not appear to be any identifiably Jewish features, either in the ingredients or references to the use of dishes in, for instance, religious rites or feasts. So that's one thing. What, to my mind, makes it even less likely that they are Jewish dishes is that some of the, in fact, most of those recipes end with "and serve it, inshallah." So what is going on here? Was it a dish perhaps that was once made by a Jewish cook? Was there at some point a connection of one? History isn't there to tell us. Now, the absence, of course, is only surprising because of the expectation that there would have been a difference in diet between the religious communities. I would contend that the Andalusian food actually reveals a true spirit of convivencia, a living together of the communities, the various religious communities under Muslim rule, and therefore there was no real difference when it came to the day-to-day diet. There would only have been differences in terms of certain ritual foods. But of course, there was no need or call for those to be included in the cookery books. If I can have the next slide, please. Now we can take a look at some of the dishes to illustrate the points, or some of the points that I've made. And so it's kind of the history of Andalusian cuisine through a couple of recipes. And the first one I chose because it is no doubt the most emblematic dish of Al-Andalus. It's a mujabbana, and a mujabbana essentially is a deep fried bun. And as you can see, it was eaten with honey. So the mujabbanas, and there were many different recipes, were truly Andalusian. They're not found in any of the other Eastern cookery books. And of course, we have dairy here. It has to be, so it's either dairy and or cheese and or eggs. And we have some interesting secondary information about the way in which the mujabbana was bound up with Andalusian identity. This time we've already visited 8th century Al-Andalus. This time I'm taking you to the 15th century. And the 15th century, there's an Egyptian traveler who arrives in Tunis, and he's invited to a banquet. He's invited to a banquet held by leading members of the Andalusian community. Many of the Andalusians, of course, went south. Many settled in Tunis and elsewhere in North Africa. But Tunis has a large community. And what do we find? The traveler, the Egyptian traveler, explains in great detail how one of the dignitaries, of Andalusian origin dignitaries, made the mujabbanas. So here we clearly have proof of the inextricable link between Andalusianness, if you will, and the mujabbana. So the mujabbana was prepared not by chef, but it was prepared in front of the diners in order to really display and bring home the significance and link with Andalusian identity. If we can move on to the next slide, please. Thank you very much. And here we have the tharid. Now, the tharid, another interesting case. You remember I said that quite a few dishes, of course, came from the East, and the tharid is a wonderful dish to illustrate the point that dishes, though they were foreign originally, were transformed, were naturalized, were Andalusianized, if you will. And the tharid, which originally is a dish from the Arabian Gulf, the Arabian Peninsula, although we can trace its ultimate origin back even to Mesopotamian times, the tharid, of course, quite famous because it was also said to be one of the favorite dishes of the Prophet Muhammad. Now, the tharid, why was it not? There are some examples, but not many tharid or tharida dishes in the Near East, because it was considered to be peasant food. In Al-Andalus, people really took to it with a vengeance. So this is an example of a dish profoundly Eastern, but transformed. And so the Andalusian variety is made with a bread that is still around today, the musamman. Those who have been to Morocco will have had the joy of tasting this amazing bread. It's kind of layered, laminated bread. And so this, of course, is the predecessor of the contemporary Moroccan rafisa. And so what is Andalusian here? Well, I have to start, of course, with the eggs. The eggs are part of the dish. Olives, also very Andalusian. Preserved limes, again, an ingredient that we find very much in prominence in Morocco and Moroccan cuisine today. And then equally Andalusian is the fact that before serving, it was sprinkled with cinnamon and ginger, a rather unusual combination, I think, for most people, but I can guarantee that it's absolutely delightful. The final element in the Andalusianness, or rather the historic nature of the dish, is that the author, Et-Tujibi, explains that it is a Tunisian specialty and that apparently it was eaten in the capital, Tunis, and often made at celebrations. So the tarid, in a way, is a microcosm of so many of the things that we talked about. And then we end with what is my own favorite dish of the medieval Arab culinary tradition. If I can have the next slide, please. And here we have the judaba. The judaba, a very odd word. The word no longer exists in Arabic. It's a word of Persian origin. And it was one of the most famous dishes across the entire Islamic world. Now, to the right, you have what it started out as in life in the Near East, and that is a drip pudding. So the idea is that you have several flat loaves that are layered with fruit, and then a chicken is roasted above these flatbreads, and you end up with a pudding or a kind of cake, which doesn't taste meaty, strangely enough. So the cake is infused with the basting juices of the chicken. Of course, not for vegetarians, this dish. Now, very famous dish, and this is one that possibly was introduced by our friend, the aesthete Ziryab. Now, in Al-Andalus, it underwent dramatic changes, yet without changing its name. So it was still a judaba. But so the recipe that you can see here that I've recreated, which is drawn from Et-Tujibi's book, is quite different. The first thing that one notices, of course, is that there is no meat. So it's not made with meat. Instead, it's made with very thin flatbreads, in Arabic, ruqaq, which alternate with layers of almond, sugar, and of course, various aromatic spices, and to cap it all, saffron. And of course, they had a sweet tooth, so they would pour on some rose water, of course, and olive oil before baking it in the oven. And then, as if that wasn't sweet enough, it was also eaten with a rose syrup, sweetened with sugar, of course, and some fresh butter. So the judaba is a wonderful example of an Eastern dish, profoundly, quintessentially Eastern dish, that was transformed into a specifically Andalusian, peculiarly Andalusian dish. And if you listen to the ingredients that I've just mentioned with regard to judaba, of course, I should add that many of those would become very important and prominent flavors in medieval Arab cuisine, like the rosewater, like almonds. And of course, let's not forget, sugar was also introduced by the Arabs into Christian Europe. And so here we have really everything that's coming together. Andalusian ingredients, an Andalusian twist on an Eastern original, and then, of course, that link with other cuisines and the great influence exerted by the Arab culinary tradition on medieval European cookery. And with that, I'd like to thank you very much.
Wow, thank you very much, Professor Newman. That was an incredibly interesting talk. So much there to enjoy. Thank you. Although I am pretty hungry now after that. I'm going to throw this across to Katarzyna in the MACFEST team now. So if anyone's got any questions for Professor Newman, Katarzyna will take us through them. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for this fascinating presentation, Professor Newman. Absolutely fantastic research. I loved your event last year. I'm looking forward to every next one with you. We had some really nice comments in the audience. Let's have a look. Yes, fascinating history and culture. I really hope I can go and visit this country. I think muri is very hard to prepare because it is the component of many ingredients. That's one comment. Excellent presentation. Yes, could be muri something similar to garum.
Well, it is often translated, if you will, as garum. There are differences. There are differences and there are similarities. In terms of use, garum, of course, is also fermented. There's fermented fish, which was left out in the sun. Murri, the overwhelming majority of recipes, in fact, bar one, are all made with cereals. The fish murri, as I said, is a relative of garum, but the fish murri was made quite differently. But yes, there are differences. I mean, even soya sauce, if you think about it, also the result of fermentation. The Thai fish sauces. So there's a lot of, I think, similar sauces that all serve a particular purpose. They're all salty. They're the result of fermentation. So in that sense, yes, it's part of the same field, if you will.
And just another question on that topic. I read that muri tastes like soy sauce. Is that correct?
Yes, I can confirm that.
Okay. Thank you so much. I'm just going through the earlier comments. We do have one question. Can you post the information on the last slide again? Is it possible, Steve, that we go back to the last slide just very quickly so we don't lose anything?
Katarzyna, there is a question which says, Can you remind me what is the name of this book about cuisine from Al-Andalus, and where can I find it? It's from Fiona Hill.
It's the Exile's Cookbook, and it's available through the publisher Saki Books or through Amazon.co.uk.
I love the title. Can you give us a bit more detail why you chose this title, Exile Cookbook, please?
Yes, because he of course is an exile, and as I said, when he was compiling the book, it's very clear to me that he was trying to preserve a heritage, and so here we have somebody who is looking back and brings his native culture back to life through something which is so inextricably linked to what makes us human, and that is food. So it's the exile, and it conjures up images of sadness, belonging, separation, of course, and finally loss. And here we have the book of a man who is trying to bring to life all those things that he's lost. So it's almost like a paean to his native land, Al-Andalus, that he was forced to leave.
I've got another question I spotted. It says here in the chat, Professor Daniel, based on your research and wide experience, what is your favorite spices and food?
In the medieval Arab tradition, there are so many dishes that I like. In terms of spices, I've become very partial to the spice combinations of the Arab culinary tradition, and also using spices that perhaps are not used very frequently anymore. So I'm thinking of things like spikenard, a wonderful aromatic. I'm thinking of things like caraway. So it has, and also by recreating the dishes, of course, I've acquired somewhat of a medieval palate. But really there's and the sweets, don't get me started on the sweets, many of which incidentally have survived. So the qataif that you eat today is essentially a medieval one. It has hardly changed. The only thing that's changed is the filling, which today, of course, is cream, although they have other things in there too. Yes, so there's really a cross, and then the pickles. I'm also very partial to the pickled vegetables that they did, turnip pickles and things of that nature. Yeah, it's difficult to choose, actually.
Thank you so much. There's a comment by Patsy Kane. She says, thanks so much. Such interesting detail and connections across countries and cultures. And talking about countries, Professor Newman, you've got people across the world joining you. From one end, America, Tennessee, etc. Other end, Indonesia, Jakarta, and in between, Spain and UK. And if I missed anyone, apologies. I've been locked out of the chat. I could not make any comments today. So I'm just orally thanking people. Any other questions, everyone, please do post them, or any other comments for this amazing session. This is our second year with Professor Newman, and I've already got a topic for you, Professor, for next year. Arab medicine, you mentioned that earlier. Tell us a little bit about it as a teaser for next year.
Well, Arab medicine is, of course, also linked to food. And within the medical framework in Islamic medicine, medieval Islamic medicine, food was medicine and medicine was food. And so our bodies are only in balance if we eat the right foods, which agree with, on the one hand, our temperament, the seasons, our age, very important that, and also whether or not we engage in a lot of physical activity. And so all of this sounds very modern, and yes, it is. You know, it's a very, very holistic approach to the human body, and one that I think we have a lot to learn from.
Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to hosting that for next year. I think there is a question by Dr. Salim Adius. Katarzyna, you want to read it, please?
I can't see
QA.
in the Q&A. He began by teaching the people of Cordoba the most complicated recipes from the cuisine of Baghdad. It's a quote, actually. He also introduced asparagus into Spain. He taught them how to conserve food by pickling, bringing a large variety of spices, dried fruits, and fruit syrup with him. Can we say that without Ziryab and Andalusian Muslims, European cuisine would be very weak or less taste?
Without Andalusian cuisine, yes. Without Ziryab, although I'm a great fan of Ziryab, he's quite the character. There's a whole mythology around him. I think that the things that he introduced would eventually have made their way to Al-Andalus anyway, because one of the things that anybody researching food history finds out is the degree of mobility. And I mentioned mobility a couple of times in the talk. So there were very intensive exchanges between various regions. And so I think that those dishes would have, and ingredients, sorry, would have made their way to Al-Andalus, maybe a later time by somebody else, but I think that's perhaps giving a little bit too much credit to Ziryab, although he was definitely important, and it is possible that without him, you know, we wouldn't have had the asparagus, who knows, or only much later. But yes, the European cuisine, the flavors, in fact, up until the 18th century, European cuisine had a decidedly Arab flavor pattern. And so, you know, as I mentioned, the use of rose water, almonds, and so on. You know, marzipan also originally an Arab dish, Arab creation, though that may well go back to Persia, in fact. So yes, so I think European cuisine would have been a lot more bland than it was. Because obviously their use of spices, I'm thinking things like cloves, also, of course, arrived through the Arab tradition, and Al-Andalus was an obvious conduit. Of course, you know, Sicily and Italy would have been another one, but Al-Andalus definitely a major conduit because people were living cheek by jowl.
Thank you very much for that. We've got a lovely comment from Penelope. It's been amazing to hear your voice and listen to you, not only reading your posts on Instagram. Thank you for a great presentation, sharing your knowledge. I've learned a lot, mashallah.
Thank you so much. That's a really nice comment.
Before handing back to you, Katarzyna, I want to thank in particular two of our attendees who regularly attend, and because they're at the other end of the world, I want to name them if they don't mind. One is Karen B, sitting in America early in the morning. She's joining us, and she joins us very regularly, almost every panel. And then we have Bung Ivan, sitting in Jakarta. It's right at the end of the day, almost midnight, and month of Ramadan. And can you imagine they're here? So they can't speak to us, but a special warm thank you to all of you. Now back to Katarzyna, so you can thank everyone.
Thank you so much, as I said, to Professor Newman for a fascinating presentation, to Andrew for great hosting again, and thank you to our MACFEST team, to Steve in the background, and Xuan for today's opening. We hope to see more of you on our upcoming events. And before we close, I'd like to invite everybody to more events on the topic of food. So we've got one next Sunday, Food and the Fine Arts of Healing. There is another one on 7th of April, Food Stories from the Middle East. And in between, we've got an event on 6th of April, First Moroccans in Manchester. So please do join us. And yes, we've got one more comment. Excellent presentation, Professor Newman. As a Spanish citizen, I think Al-Andalus was an amazing mix of cultures and influences that were also reflected in cuisine. I think that's a beautiful comment to end our session today with. So thank you, everyone, and I hope to see all of you and more next weekend.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you,
Thank
Professor
you.
Newman,
Thank you,
for an amazing session.
Thank you to everybody who joined us.